Welcome everyone and happy Friday. Thanks for tuning in to our Penn GSE live webinar series today. The GSE live series is hosted by the Penn GSE Center for Professional Learning. The Center for Professional Learning designs and delivers professional learning opportunities that support educators, leaders, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and other professionals to deepen their knowledge, build their networks, and grow their careers. One such opportunity that will be beginning soon is the Social Emotional Teaching and Learning Virtual Institute. This program prepares educators, administrators, and leaders to support healthy and equity-oriented SEL in their classrooms, schools, and organizations. You can learn more about and register for the Social Emotional Teaching and Learning Virtual Institute at tinyurl.com/SETL spring 2022. We'll also post a link directly in the chat shortly. Another exciting opportunity on the horizon is PBL for Global Climate Justice. This program brings together secondary school educators from across the country and around the world to design project-based learning curricula focused on problems and questions of global climate change. You can learn more about and register for PBL for Global Climate Justice at tinyurl.com/PBL Climate 2022. And we'll also post a link to that in the chat. Today's webinar will be hosted by Taylor Hausberg. Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you, Alana. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this Penn GSE Live webinar series. My name is Taylor Hausberg, and I work with the Center for Professional Learning based at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Representation Matters has become a rallying cry heard across a wide range of domains, from film to finance, from the arts to academia. But does representation really make a difference? And if so, how? We are fortunate to have Laronnda Thompson here with us today to speak about this question in the context of children's literature. Laronnda Thompson is a Ph.D. candidate at Penn GSE. Her research investigates how books for children and young adults shape their understanding of themselves, others, and the world around them. A West Philadelphia native, Laronnda previously planned to become a middle school English language arts and literacy teacher, and first came to Penn GSE to pursue a master's in reading, writing, and literacy. However, through her coursework and the mentoring connections that she experienced as an RWL student, Laronnda came to realize that to address her concerns for education, she needed a different skill set, leading her to pursue a Ph.D. in Interdisciplinary Studies in Human Development. Laronnda, welcome. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Taylor. This is exciting.
In the next 30 minutes, I'll begin by asking Laronnda a few questions. If you all, our listeners, have any questions that come up as we're talking, please type them in the chat or Q&A. We'll get to a few of your questions in the last 10 minutes or so. And also, if you have any tech issues, please type those in the Q&A or chat too. All right, Laronnda, let's start off. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal and professional path to researching and working on this topic?
Yeah, so in high school, I became very much a fan of the creative arts, and I entered a variety of writing contests. And so I went to college very much believing I wanted to tell people stories. I thought that we could address some very serious intercultural, community-based disconnections and issues if we really got to the heart of people's lives and their stories. And as you mentioned in my introduction, what I discovered the first time was that journalism and sort of the conventions of it didn't quite meet what my goals were. So I ended up working in community development and nonprofits, working with students who were maybe described one way prior to working with them. And then once I had them in my classes, I quickly discovered that given the right materials I now understand to belong to culturally relevant curriculum. they flourished and they really enjoyed, English language arts and, all the things that I was told that they previously struggled with. So then I came to GSE because I wanted to be a classroom teacher. And I still have great love and great respect for that field. And what I also discovered in that process was just that some of the concerns I realized before coming to GSE, and then that I continued seeing as I continued volunteering while I was in my original master's program, were much more rooted around curriculum and like an underappreciation for the messages children were able to distill and sort of pick up from what is and isn't said, whose stories are and are not told, and the way they're positioned. So I switched gears to start studying from a developmental perspective. What does ELA and the materials that we use to produce literacy, what do they do to the ways in which we understand the world and ourselves?
So Laronnda, I want to draw on your expertise of youth development. And I'd love to know, why do the stories that we read to our children, to our students, matter? Perhaps we can start with on the psychological level.
I think to begin with, we have to bear in mind that while children are not born, they're not blank slates when they come to us, right? Even in the world, but they're certainly not blank slates by the time we meet them in kindergarten or even preschool. They've had some amount of years where they've been exposed to their culture, their family norms and stories, maybe oral narratives, oral stories, long before they come into our classrooms. So they may not have the sophisticated understanding of the world that you and I do, but they do have an understanding, and they're able to integrate new meanings as they progress in age. So the books and stories like that, they give children a way in which to understand things they haven't seen yet, which is to say they become materials for their world building. What is a tiger? What does it do? Is it safe? Is it friendly? What is a mayor? What does he or she do? What do they look like? What kind of decisions do they have to make? All these things that are contained in stories, they structure the ways in which children can sort of imagine the world outside of themselves. Another part to think about in development, we talk about ecological systems a lot, which are sort of depicted as sort of like circles within circles, right? And in each sphere there's different levels of influence that come from the child's immediate family all the way up to sort of like global or national politics. So if you think about what's happening in the world right now in Ukraine, right? Children are still exposed to these stories, even though they may not be directly exposed to them, even though we're not necessarily like elevating them to them to process and ingest every day. They're still hearing bits and pieces. So while we know as adults, it matters the way we talk to them when they ask questions about it, it also matters what they read and what movies or other images, illustrations they're seeing when they talk about these different issues. Rather, it's something that's happening as immediately as today or something that happened, as far ago as the 1920s.
And it's not difficult to imagine those concentric circles and understand how those changes and those impacts at the psychological level have important social implications.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's also important to think about too when we're thinking about how children are influenced, thinking about the world. We also are creating through books and the narratives they contain pathways for children to even understand themselves, right? And by no means is my work or the field that studies representation sort of limited to just the K5 or K3 arena, right? It goes throughout the educational and developmental trajectory, right? So, at a very early age, you might ask or think about, what does a bad guy look like to a child? Is it Lord Voldemort? Is it Columbus? Is it Swiper No Swiping from Dora, right? Then maybe later on questions like, what is kindness? Like what is Matilda? If you think of those stories, how does she retain and embody her kindness? And in high school, it might become a little more complex, right? So if you think of Catcher in the Rye, there's Holden, and Holden is very much understood to sort of behave in an eccentric or inappropriate way because he's sort of working through a mental illness, right? But there's also Wuthering Heights, and there's Heathcliff, who is quickly aligned with just being vengeful and being cruel. Heathcliff is described as not only the adopted son, but he's a darker character in the story. So what are those additional narratives saying to children about who gets to have a mental health illness and who doesn't?
Right, right. Yeah, and I think you point out such an important part that the psychological changes have important social ripple effects, and the social environment and the social understanding of the world has important psychological individual level effects.
Absolutely.
So, Laronnda, I want to clarify what it is exactly we're talking about here. You've mentioned the word representation. So let's think about that in the context of a library. What is a representative library? What does that look like? And is that the same as a diverse library?
That's an excellent question. It's a tricky question. Because the honest answer is a representative and even a diverse library should be one that's fluid in that it's continually being updated, right? What's happening in our world doesn't necessarily just happen at one time, and it's not the same thing, throughout even 2 years, right? If you think about what 2019 looked like for most of the world to what 2022 looks like, right? A lot has changed beyond just the pandemic. So a representative library isn't one that you just curate the first time and you're done. It's something you have to continually update, keeping in mind what's going on in larger social contexts, then even smaller community contexts. You have to get to know your students, and you have to think about now, particularly in terms of representation, and this is where it diverges from diversity or even inclusion. It's not just, do I have a book depicting an African-American character? Do I have a book depicting a queer character? Do I have a book depicting a character that speaks another language? Do I have a book about a child with disability? It's about what are those books saying as well, right? It's what representations, not just in the depictions, or are they having a good day? Are they doing things that seem, appropriate for this age group? But what messages are they saying about their world and, life in general? So we're thinking about, another way to think about this is if you think about our government, right, and like the House of Representatives, it's not that any of those representatives knows exactly what Laronnda thinks or would say exactly what Laronnda would say. But ideally, they are representing the best interests of me and of my state, right? And so our representative library should also represent, or should contain, advocate for, support, nurture the best interests of diverse children, right? Or differentiating children. The other important line to draw with diversity versus representation is that you could decide that you're going to have, this is often used in a lot of spaces, but I'll bring it up here. You could decide you're going to have a picnic or a barbecue, and you want to, have diverse beverages, right? So you have tea and you have juice and you have soda, and it looks different, but in fact, they're all sort of these maybe sugary caffeinated drinks. There's not true differences between them. So creating a representative library requires a lot of noticing of, our students, individual differences between ourselves. What is it? What are my cultures? Not just the larger ones we often talk about in terms of race or gender, but what are my norms? What are my expectations? And then what are those happening inside of my classroom or my library?
So for educators who want to curate a representative library, where should they start?
So there are two great websites that I always recommend people get familiar with. The first is We Need Diverse Books, and they're both landing pages. The second is the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin School of Education. And they both contain additional links that will send you to great articles, great resources. CCBC, which is the Cooperative Children's Book Center, also has a way in which you can directly ask questions if you're struggling with finding books. Lots of other statistics on what types of books are published and where. And another great way for educators to really dive into what does it mean to have a representational library is through social media. So following the hashtag representation matters, following We Need Diverse Books hashtags, Books in Power, things of that nature. They're all really excellent hashtags to follow both on Twitter and on Instagram. And then often you'll find other educators, other people in my field who are studying the same thing, tweeting and posting and writing the same thing. And when you find something of interest, follow them, message them. Most people will be quite open to, responding to questions and concerns.
Mhm. So once educators, get their hands on these books and bring them into the classroom, is it enough just to have these books in a classroom or a school library? And what else might educators need to do to support students' engagement with these diverse representative stories?
Before educators even bring these books into their classroom, they should really take some time with them themselves, right? There's a bit of self work that's involved in sort of curating this representational library that's meaningful to children. And the reason I say self work is, again, you and I and everyone, we all have our norms from the way we grew up, the ways in which we expect a story to work, the ways in which we expect a character to be in a story, right? The way in which we think about what makes for a happy ending. And so whenever, even as adults, we engage with something that's different, there's a possibility that our own sort of surprise or even biases or preferences, if you will, can sort of come through in the reading of that story or come through in the ways that we might answer questions about different characters. So the self-work comes in and sort of getting your books together, spending some time reading it, the things that you may not be well informed about, the things that you find surprising, the things that you're, having some sort of emotional reaction. So there's a lot of monitoring, self-monitoring that goes on during this. Those are the areas where, maybe I need to do a little research. I need to learn a little deeper. I need to understand why this story is functioning in this way. I need to maybe read the praise and the criticism because it's something separate than what I've been exposed to. And going back to earlier, talking about this idea of us all growing up in sort of like these ecologies, right? These circles of influence. It's important to remember that we're adults and the time in which we grew up, right, is sort of a past time. And the things that were really salient or meaningful to us, right, that maybe shaped our experiences in K-12 or even college have shifted, right? And today's children are encountering different questions, different information, different expectations of what schools and books and materials are supposed to do. So that's maybe the first step in creating that classroom library. And then once you've sort of gotten comfortable with the books you're going to use, then it's the question of like, once you bring them into the classroom, are they just there? Like, is it just, are you leaving it up to children to sort of like pick up these books, or are you reading them and recommending them and, showing them off the way you might your own personal favorite from your own childhood? Are you showing them equal love?
So I have a few more questions, but I just want to re-encourage our listeners to type their questions into either the Q&A or chat so we can be sure to address those as well. So Laronnda, building on that second part of your response, I'm curious, how do you feel about having children choose their own books versus assigning them stories to read?
I think ideally it should be a mixture of the two at a certain point, but we also have to think about how old are our children, right? So, do they embody or do they feel, autonomous enough to pick their own book? And if they are picking their own book, are we noticing that they're continuing to pick the same type of book? Because the other part of representation that often gets left out in these conversations is that it's sort of positioned as if it's really good for a certain type of child, right? It's really good for the minority child. And that could be the racial minority child. It could be the child that's growing up in out-of-home care, the child that we sort of think maybe has a different or even an atypical experience in the world. They need to see themselves. And that's true. But what's also true is the child that we might think of as the majority, they also need experience and opportunity to engage with stories that are different, right? To develop their own or to strengthen their own ability to take perspectives and see from other points of view and understand that the world isn't utterly reflective. Rudine Bishop Sims coined the phrase windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And they're good for all children. All children need to be encouraged through sliding glass doors to view the world through windows and to see reflections of themselves. So in regards to whether or not a teacher should assign books or should let children select their own. You want to create a mixture of the two. And if you happen to find that children are sort of self-selecting into the same types of books, then maybe you do more like of you curate a list of books that they can choose from, which will still give them some autonomy in what they're selecting, but will also sort of shift them maybe from a way like of introducing them to a different type of book or a different story.
Mhm, mhm. So we're starting to get some questions from our listeners, so I'll go ahead and voice those.
Mhm.
First, we have one from Maritza Mulite. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. But Maritza asks, first she says, thank you so much, Laronnda, for sharing your expertise. How have you looked into this topic in your dissertation work?
So I've looked into this topic again through developmental frameworks. So I look at theory of mind particularly, right? And theory of mind basically stipulates as an overarching body of work that around the age of 4, children gain the ability to realize that, you know, we have subjective independent thoughts. So just because I know something, Taylor, you don't automatically know it unless you were there to witness it. And particularly, I look at this as children grow older. So around the age of 6, they develop interpretive theory of mind, where they're able to make really powerful inferences. So, like, let's say this was actually my office behind me full of books. A child might come in here and like, oh, Laronnda, you really like to read. You have so many books, right? They're able to sort of draw, you know, implicit information and make meaningful or accurate even conclusions out of it. And when that applies to books, what I'm theorizing could be happening is that they're starting to pick up these stories and notice who's in them and who's not in them. And they're internalizing that message at a deeper level. You know, I, as an African American, a lot of books about me show up during the month of February, right? Or I, as a woman, a lot of stories about me show up during the month of March. But where am I during the rest of the year? Do I only exist in moments where you need to elevate me? Do I have a normal experience of going to the zoo or visiting my grandparents the way my peers or the children in other stories might? And so I look at how children are making meaning at very early ages. So I work with preschool to 3rd grade, and I'm looking at how they're making meaning at what we also think of as like crucial ages for the development of reading skill, and how the stories are informing them to think about the world and what messages they're taking away from what characters and what stories are depicted.
Thanks, Laronnda. Thank you for doing that work. And thank you, Maritza, for the question. We have another question from Carrie Ann Mosley asking, how can educators approach the exclusion or forced exclusion of classic books that work against a diverse society like Curious George, Peter Pan, Dr. Seuss? Would it be effective to present these controversial books alongside representative books?
Absolutely. I'm actually quite against banned books. The reason I'm against banned books is because I'm against banned knowledge, and I believe that human beings have the capacity to work through difficulty. That being said, it doesn't necessarily mean that you introduce these books, you know, freely, right, or without a plan. If you're using these books in the conversation in the classroom, it's often to do exactly as Carrie Ann described, sort of explaining what this book was saying or what was problematic in this book, and then maybe looking to like the response that has developed to this book, right? Learning, teaching children to work through areas of difference and difficulty, but also what we call in development and many other fields too, is like standing in the both and, right? Where like Curious George could present a funny story if you're not hyper, or not even hyper, but if you're not aware of the racial overtones, right? And that could be true. And it can also be true that it can be a racist book. And so working through that, I think that is, you know, we have the cognitive capacity to handle conflict and difference. And so we have to not be afraid to engage in that.
Yeah, thanks, Laronnda. Rhonda Atwater says, my name is Rhonda. Thanks for this discussion. I am a high school ELA teacher at a predominantly Latino school. I see the importance of diverse literature in the courses I teach, but how do I communicate the importance of using materials that highlight inclusivity and diversity of our students in subject areas outside of ELA? Any words of wisdom for Rhonda?
I have great colleagues that work with me in those areas. That would be great to like share some resources about that maybe later there's a way. But um, part of it is sort of what's happening in sort of the faculty meetings, right? And thinking about what do themes and units look like across, our school. Um, Also reminding our colleagues even, so some of this again is like more like behind the scenes work, reminding our colleagues that education is meant to prepare children for the real world. It's meant to sort of give them the tools to navigate not only job or careers but interpersonal skills. It's meant to um, enable them to go into fields where they will be underrepresented perhaps, or where they will be in charge of um, increasing diversity efforts, even though they themselves may not feel like a diverse person, although actually we all are, but they may not feel that way. And so are we giving them the tools at every level and in all the different ways in which they matter to perform, once they leave our classrooms?
Great. Maybe just one last question for you, Laronnda. This one comes from Dominique Howell, who asks, how would you suggest parents or teachers advocate for public libraries to create diverse representation for children?
I think that's also a great question. How would I say advocate for public libraries? I mean, so I'm going to go back a little bit to recommending CCBC, the Children's Collaborative Book Center, because they published phenomenal articles about the world of publishing, right? And how for very many years, the world of publishing was predominantly white. Then there have been follow-up articles that have looked at the English canon, right? And that the books that we hold in high regard are predominantly white. And then there are competing statistics that talk about the makeup of the US and the makeup of the world is not predominantly white. And even when it is racially white, there's so much diversity that happens within there, right? From socioeconomic status to language to just every point that you could pick. And so I think some of these arguments happen when you actually are able to go to different community nonprofits and say, these are the issues and this is what I would like to do about it. Sometimes correcting the system in a way means subverting the system, and then the system catches up, right? Like you have to, this is a need and I'm going to address it. And then once I've established that, I'm able to bring you all on board.
Great. Thanks for those tips, Laronnda. Laronnda, thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like we could keep going. I still have so many questions. This is just the tip of the iceberg of your knowledge and expertise, I'm sure. But Laronnda, as we close, I'd just like to give you the last word. Any final thoughts, tips, encouragements, calls to action for, the wide range of listeners we have on this call today, for our teachers, administrators, higher education scholars, et cetera?
Yeah, don't be afraid of representation and diversity, right? I mean, I know in many ways it could feel overwhelming. Some people may even feel, personally targeted when we bring up the lack of inclusion in books, right? But it's really to everyone's benefit that we work through the areas we find difficult or are unsure about, because the world truly is a diverse place. I mean, I ask people all the time, when have you ever read a book about a child in foster care? When have you ever read a book about a child dealing with their own mental illness, even if you will, right? Mm-hmm. They're members of our society. They're our neighbors, they're our loved ones, but yet we don't want their stories for some reason. And that really has to change if we really want to work towards and I don't say this in like the grandiose way of like the American ideals, but honestly, if we want to work towards a society where everyone feels included, but not just feels included, but is enjoying the benefits of being included and is able to work to his or her capacity, we have to not be afraid to sort of engage with those that are different.
Laronnda, thank you for your important insights and sharing your wisdom with us. It has been such a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you who joined us for this conversation. Thank you to the Penn GSE Center for Professional Learning for supporting this event. We love hearing what you think about these conversations. So if you have 30 seconds right now, we would greatly appreciate it if you could fill out this very short feedback form. The link is on the slide, and we'll also email it to you and stick it in the chat here. If you like what you heard, please share what you learned. You can check out other opportunities offered by our center at gsc.upenn.edu/academics/professional-learning. We hope to see you again soon.